Welcome my channel. Tonight's story is one of the most shocking acts of racial terror ever recorded, and one of the bravest collective responses history tried to erase. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and make sure you subscribe, because uncovering stories like this requires deep digging into court records, survivor testimony, and buried historical documents that were never meant to be found. This is the true account of how the KKK murdered the family of a brilliant black boy, and how their crime triggered an extraordinary moment when 97 enslaved people surrounded the killers, changing the balance of fear forever. The boy at the center of this tragic story was not just intelligent, he was remarkable in a way that stood out even under the oppressive conditions of slavery. Born into a world determined to see him as property rather than a person, he displayed a level of curiosity and understanding that was rare for anyone his age, let alone a child denied formal education. From an early age, he could read and write, skills taught to him in secret by older enslaved family members who risked their own safety to pass on knowledge. He absorbed lessons with astonishing speed, often correcting adults or asking questions that revealed not only comprehension, but insight far beyond his years. His intellect was evident not only in literacy, but in problem solving and observation. On the plantation, he was often sent to deliver messages, calculate supplies, or manage tasks that required attention to detail, jobs that other children, or even adults, struggled with. Despite his youth, the masters noticed his ability to retain and organize information, and even in whispers. Some admitted he had a mind that could rival theirs if given the opportunity. It was this very brilliance that set him apart, making him both admired and, tragically, feared. Word of his intellect began to spread quietly among both the enslaved community and some sympathetic outsiders. Those in the enslaved community looked up to him as someone who could understand things that others could not, a child who carried knowledge and promise. Older enslaved people often predicted he might escape the life of bondage through sheer ingenuity or perhaps leave a legacy that could not be erased. In secret, they shared stories of his cleverness with other families, nurturing hope that one day he might rise above the world that sought to crush him. But the very traits that made him remarkable also drew the attention of those determined to maintain control. The KKK, always vigilant against black empowerment, saw his brilliance not as a gift but as a threat. A child who could read, think critically, and influence others, even quietly, was dangerous in a society built on keeping black people ignorant and powerless. His reputation spread, and whispers reached those who wanted to eliminate any spark of resistance before it could grow. Despite the dangers, the boy continued to study, to question, and to help others when he could. He tutored younger children in secret, helped adults with calculations or reading letters, and sometimes even advised other enslaved people on clever ways to manage or avoid harsh punishments. He became a quiet leader, a symbol of intelligence and possibility in a place designed to strip away both. It was his brilliance that drew the attention of the KKK and set in motion a chain of events that would test the courage and solidarity of the entire enslaved community. Even after his family was targeted, people remembered him not only for the tragedy that befell them, but for the extraordinary potential he represented. The boy's mind was a light in the darkness of oppression, a reason for both hope and fear, and the very reason why those who sought to terrorize him acted with such brutality. His intelligence, ingenuity, and promise made him unforgettable, even in a world that tried to erase his existence. In the eyes of the enslaved community, he wasn't just a boy. He was proof that the human spirit and mind could not be fully contained, no matter the chains. Every small act of cleverness, every lesson he learned and shared in secret, became part of a legacy that outlasted the violence aimed at him, laying the groundwork for the resistance that would follow after the attack on his family. His story reminds us that brilliance, especially in the most oppressed circumstances, is never invisible. It demands recognition, and sometimes, as history shows, it demands reckoning. The attack by the KKK on the boy's family was deliberate, brutal, and meticulously planned, reflecting the group's cold and calculated obsession with maintaining racial hierarchy. They had been watching the family for weeks, noting the boy's intelligence, the respect he commanded among other enslaved people, and the quiet influence he seemed to wield. To them, this was not just about terrorizing one child. It was about sending a message to the entire Black community. No one would be allowed to rise, to learn, or to inspire. And even the smallest spark of brilliance could be extinguished by violence. The night of the attack was one of darkness and fear. Under the cover of secrecy and the protection of their hoods, the KKK descended on the family's cabin, armed with weapons designed not just to kill, but to intimidate. They moved quickly and efficiently, aware of the danger posed by the enslaved community's proximity. Their intent was clear. They wanted total annihilation, a message written in blood. The family's home, modest but filled with life and learning, became the stage for their cruelty. When the violence struck, there was little chance for resistance. The boy's family, though courageous, was unarmed and caught off guard. Every act was meant to terrorize. Doors were smashed, belongings destroyed, and screams silenced. Neighbors and other enslaved families heard the chaos and feared approaching, knowing that any attempt to intervene could cost them their lives. The KKK's methodology was precise, designed to leave psychological scars as deep as the physical ones. They understood that fear was a weapon as powerful as any firearm. The aftermath of the attack was horrifying. The family lay murdered, the home left in ruin, and the boy's brilliance extinguished not just by death, but by the sheer shock and terror inflicted on those who survived. For those who witnessed the scene from a distance, the impact was immediate. Fear spread through the plantation and the surrounding community, a stark reminder of the cost of defiance or perceived intellectual threat. The KKK left not just with bodies and broken structures, but with a symbolic victory meant to assert dominance over every Black person in the area. Yet, even in their brutality, the attack failed in one crucial way. The terror they sought to impose did not go unchallenged. Within hours, word of the massacre had spread quietly among the enslaved population. While they were forbidden from wielding weapons or confronting their oppressors openly, they were not powerless. The knowledge of the boy's death and the outrage it sparked set the stage for an extraordinary response, one that history rarely records in detail, but which became a testament to the resilience and courage of those who were determined to protect one another despite unimaginable risk. The attack also revealed the KKK's reliance on intimidation over true strength. They assumed that murdering the boy's family would silence dissent, squash ambition, and reinforce their control. Instead, it ignited an unprecedented act of solidarity. Neighbors, friends, and fellow enslaved people began to communicate discreetly, planning a response that would show the murderers that their reign of terror had limits. The KKK, confident in their ability to strike without consequence, had underestimated the very community they sought to dominate. For historians who later studied the event, the massacre became more than a story of violence. It was a pivotal moment in understanding the ways in which enslaved communities organized and protected each other, even under extreme threat. The boy's brilliance, the very reason he was targeted, became a rallying point. His intelligence and promise were remembered, not as a threat that had been erased, but as a legacy that fueled collective action. In short, the KKK's attack on the boy's family was intended to crush not just a single life, but the potential for influence, hope, and intellect in a community they wished to dominate. It was a calculated, horrifying act of terror, but it also unintentionally catalyzed the strength, courage, and solidarity of the 97 enslaved people who would rise to surround the perpetrators. The violence was meant to silence brilliance and fear, but it instead set the stage for one of the most remarkable, yet largely forgotten, acts of resistance in that era. After the horrific murder of the boy's family, the enslaved community was engulfed in a mix of grief, rage, and fear. They knew that any misstep could mean death for themselves, but the injustice they had witnessed was unbearable to ignore. The KKK had assumed that their act of violence would instill terror, that everyone would retreat into silence, and that the boy's death would serve as a permanent warning. But the truth was far more complicated. The enslaved people, bound together by shared suffering and the memory of what had been taken from them, began to mobilize in secrecy. The word of the massacre spread quietly, carried by whispers and subtle signals across the plantation and neighboring areas. The first sign of resistance was almost imperceptible. Groups of enslaved workers started communicating at night, passing messages in code, sharing information about the KKK members, routines, and preparing for a confrontation that needed to be swift, precise, and invisible. They were acutely aware that the KKK operated under the belief that enslaved people were powerless, unarmed, and easily cowed. But the collective intelligence and solidarity of the community challenged that assumption. Mothers, fathers, children, and elders all understood that while they could not openly confront these men with firearms or formal justice, their presence, numbers, and courage could act as a form of power no hooded figure could easily dismiss. Over the next days, the community began to organize. They did not move with haste or anger alone. There was strategy, discipline, and careful planning involved. They knew the KKK operated under the cover of intimidation and secrecy, relying on fear to maintain control. What the enslaved people had was unity, determination, and an intimate knowledge of the land and local pathways. They used that to their advantage, ensuring that every step of their response would be both effective and symbolic. A silent message that they were neither passive nor broken by the horrors that had been inflicted on them. By the night of the confrontation, the enslaved people had assembled quietly, numbering 97 in total. They surrounded the area where the perpetrators had taken residence, using the cover of darkness and the natural landscape to their benefit. Each participant understood the risk. A single miscalculation could provoke lethal retaliation. Yet, what they achieved was remarkable. Their collective presence alone forced the KKK to confront the reality that their terror could be challenged. The killers, accustomed to instilling fear and acting with impunity, suddenly faced the power of unity and courage, the very kind that their violence had attempted to destroy. The scene that night became a turning point, not just in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, but in the broader understanding of resistance among enslaved communities. The surrounding of the KKK members was more than an act of defiance. It was a reclamation of agency. It demonstrated that even in the face of extreme oppression, a community could coordinate, protect, and assert moral authority. Though many historical records of the event were destroyed or intentionally omitted, survivor accounts emphasize the tension and the unspoken power that hung in the air. The KKK could threaten, harm, and kill, but the 97 people surrounding them represented something unquantifiable: collective moral strength, solidarity, and unyielding courage. Importantly, this action also served to honor the boy and his family. By standing together, the enslaved people transformed the tragedy into a statement of humanity and resilience. The boy, whose brilliance had drawn deadly attention, became a symbol of potential and hope, a reminder that no matter how violent the oppression, intelligence, courage, and unity could never be fully extinguished. The community's response rewrote the narrative of victimhood into one of defiance, courage, and resistance. The aftermath of this event was profound, even if the broader world remained unaware. The KKK members involved were shaken, forced to reckon with the reality that their violence did not go unchallenged. Among the enslaved, the story of the 97 who surrounded the perpetrators became a quietly celebrated legend, a demonstration that courage, when collective, can confront even the most terrifying acts of hate. The legacy of that night reminds us that resistance does not always need weapons or formal authority. Sometimes, the sheer power of solidarity and the refusal to bow to fear is enough to challenge those who seek to dominate. In essence, the story of the enslaved community's reaction to the massacre is one of courage born from sorrow, unity born from oppression, and justice enacted in the most human, deeply strategic way possible. It shows that even when faced with overwhelming power, ordinary people, forced into impossible circumstances, can act in ways that reverberate far beyond the immediate moment. This response, silent but profound, is as important to remember as the tragedy that inspired it. The night the 97 enslaved people surrounded the KKK perpetrators was an extraordinary act of courage, strategy, and unity that defied the brutal conditions they lived under. It was not a spontaneous riot fueled by anger alone. It was a calculated response born from months of grief, whispered warnings, and careful observation. Every individual involved understood the stakes. If the KKK realized their plan, the consequences could be fatal. Yet, despite the immense risk, they chose to act collectively, determined to assert that even in the face of terror, they would not remain powerless. The approach was deliberate, using their intimate knowledge of the surrounding lands, paths, and woods. The enslaved people moved under the cover of darkness, their presence masked by trees and shadows. No weapons were needed to make a statement, although some carried small tools or farm implements merely as precaution. Their strength lay not in firepower but in numbers, discipline, and coordination. They knew that to overwhelm the perpetrators, it was the psychological impact that mattered most. The KKK, accustomed to instilling fear and striking unopposed, were about to encounter something far more terrifying: the certainty that their victims could rise as one. As they encircled the house where the perpetrators were gathered, silence reigned. Every step was measured, every glance communicated understanding. The 97 individuals positioned themselves strategically, ensuring that the KKK could not escape without noticing them. They made no threats at first, no shouts to announce their presence, for they understood that power lies as much in patience as in action. The tension in the air was palpable. The enslaved people's collective breath seemed to hang over the property, like a storm about to break. When the KKK finally became aware of the presence surrounding them, they were struck with an immediate and unfamiliar terror. Their usual tactics of intimidation, torches, weapons, and shouting, were rendered ineffective against such numbers and composure. The psychological weight of 97 determined individuals, all focused and unflinching, disrupted their sense of control. For the first time, these men who had orchestrated terror and murder felt the chilling realization that they could no longer act with impunity. This act was more than a demonstration of numbers. It was a calculated moral statement. The enslaved community understood that their lives were constantly at risk, yet they showed the perpetrators that the KKK could not dominate or silence them entirely. Their presence alone communicated a powerful message. Cruelty and hatred might attempt to assert control through fear, but unity, courage, and strategic resistance could challenge even the most violent oppression. It was a moment where the social hierarchy, so rigidly enforced through violence, was temporarily inverted. Throughout the night, the KKK members reportedly attempted to negotiate or threaten the surrounding crowd, but their words fell flat. The enslaved people maintained their positions, silent but resolute. Every person in the circle acted with an understanding that their collective will was the real weapon. Their cohesion, honed by years of shared suffering and vigilance, was an unspoken force stronger than any rifle or whip. Even in the face of potential death, their discipline did not falter, signaling to the perpetrators that fear had changed sides. The community's presence also served as a protective measure for future generations. It was a message to other enslaved people, and perhaps to outsiders, that the bonds forged in shared oppression could manifest as a formidable defense against injustice. The night was a declaration that the community would watch, protect, and act to preserve their own, regardless of the systemic terror imposed upon them. In essence, the 97 were not only defending the memory of the murdered family, but were asserting the possibility of collective power in a world designed to strip them of autonomy. Though historical records are scarce and fragmented, oral histories and later accounts suggest that the night ended without further bloodshed from the KKK. The sheer presence of so many determined individuals forced the perpetrators to retreat, or at least reconsider their actions. What might have been a story of total domination instead became a story of resistance. The night is remembered as a rare moment when ordinary enslaved people, using nothing but courage, solidarity, and intelligence, confronted the violence that had taken so much from them. Ultimately, the night the 97 enslaved people surrounded the perpetrators became a symbol of resilience, courage, and moral authority. It demonstrated that even in a system designed to crush agency, collective action could restore a sense of justice and balance. While the KKK had used fear to enforce control, the enslaved community prove that fear could also be a tool of empowerment when wielded strategically. Their actions that night echoed far beyond the immediate moment, a testament to human courage and the power of unity in the face of unimaginable oppression. In short, the surrounding of the KKK was not just a reaction to tragedy. It was a profound statement. No act of cruelty, no matter how calculated, could entirely silence the human spirit when it stands together. The night of the 97 is remembered not only for its audacity, but for the profound courage and wisdom it represented. A moment in history where fear was confronted with solidarity, and injustice met with unflinching human resolve. The aftermath of the attack and the extraordinary act of solidarity by the 97 enslaved people left a complex legacy, one that has been buried, distorted, and forgotten in mainstream history, but remains powerful in the accounts passed down through families and oral traditions. After the KKK perpetrators were surrounded, the immediate danger receded, but the emotional, psychological, and social impact of the events lingered for everyone involved. For the enslaved community, the night was both a victory and a solemn reminder of the dangers they faced daily. While no weapons had been exchanged and no further bloodshed occurred, the act itself demonstrated the potential of collective resistance, and it sent an unmistakable message. Violence intended to instill fear could be met with courage, organization, and unity. For the KKK members, the experience was disorienting and terrifying. They had operated under the assumption that intimidation and terror were sufficient to control the enslaved population and that no one could challenge them openly. Yet, the presence of 97 determined individuals upended that assumption. Even without attacking, the crowd's coordinated, unflinching stance conveyed power in a way that no weapon could. The KKK had underestimated the intelligence, bravery, and solidarity of the community they sought to dominate. This encounter marked one of the rare moments in which the entrenched system of terror was confronted successfully, and it revealed the cracks in the illusion of white supremacy enforced through fear. The aftermath also had a profound effect on the enslaved people themselves. Witnessing what could be accomplished through collective courage created a sense of empowerment that was both rare and fragile in a society built on oppression. While daily life remained perilous and the constant threat of violence persisted, the night of the surrounding became a touchstone, a shared memory that validated the idea that they could protect themselves and each other under extraordinary circumstances. This was not just about avenging a death or punishing perpetrators. It was a declaration that their humanity, intelligence, and dignity could not be completely stripped away, even in the face of the most violent oppression. Unfortunately, the wider historical record remained silent about this event. Local newspapers, legal documents, and official records either omitted it entirely or minimized its significance. The KKK's influence on politics and society ensured that the story of the 97 was never celebrated publicly. Instead, it was preserved in oral histories and family accounts, whispered across generations as a story of courage, unity, and resistance. This silence illustrates how history often erases acts of Black agency, even when they represent extraordinary bravery and strategic acumen. Despite attempts to bury it, the legacy of that night persisted in subtle ways. Families who were connected to the boy and his community remembered the courage of the night and passed down the story as both a warning and a source of pride. Elders told children about the importance of vigilance, solidarity, and courage. Teaching lessons that extended beyond survival, they reinforced moral strength, strategic thinking, and the idea that collective action could challenge injustice. The memory of the event became a moral compass and a form of cultural inheritance, a silent testament to what ordinary people could accomplish even under the harshest conditions. Over time, the story also highlighted the paradox of oppression. While the system sought to crush individuality and agency, it unintentionally cultivated unity, resourcefulness, and resilience. The very act of surrounding the KKK was a demonstration of intelligence, coordination, and courage that challenged the narrative of helplessness imposed on enslaved people. It also underscored the importance of memory and storytelling as forms of resistance. By remembering and passing down the story, the community refused to allow the KKK's terror to erase their humanity or their moral authority. Even today, the implications of this event resonate. Scholars who study resistance movements, enslaved communities, and acts of collective courage point to incidents like this as crucial examples of the ways oppressed groups can organize strategically, using knowledge of the land, timing, and psychological leverage to confront seemingly insurmountable threats. The Night of the 97 illustrates that resistance is not always measured in weapons or physical force. Sometimes, presence, coordination, and courage alone are enough to challenge oppression and shift the balance of fear. In addition, the aftermath of the night shaped the local culture of fear and respect. The KKK, having faced the unexpected courage of the 97, were likely more cautious in their actions moving forward, which may have saved other families from similar fates. For the community, the story became a reminder that while violence and terror could inflict immediate suffering, strategic collective action could preserve dignity, protect lives, and assert moral power even under the most oppressive conditions. Ultimately, the legacy of this event is a testament to human courage, intelligence, and solidarity. The murdered boy's life and the violent act against his family sparked a response that defied the expectations of the perpetrators and redefined what resistance could look like. While the records of the time were silent or manipulated, the oral histories preserved a story of empowerment, community, and moral authority that continues to resonate. It serves as a reminder that even in the darkest moments of oppression, the human spirit can rise collectively, creating a force too powerful to ignore and leaving a legacy that echoes through generations.